South Dakota has one of the least regulated late fee frameworks in the country, consistent with the state's overall minimalist approach to landlord-tenant regulation. The governing law is found in South Dakota Codified Laws, Title 43, Chapter 32, which covers landlord and tenant relations, along with general contract principles. If you're a landlord or tenant in South Dakota, the limited statutory framework means the lease agreement governs almost everything about late fees. Let's start with the basics. South Dakota does not have a specific statute that caps late fees. There is no percentage limit, no dollar maximum, and no statutory formula. The late fee amount is governed entirely by the lease terms and general contract principles, specifically the requirement that the fee be reasonable and not function as an unenforceable penalty. South Dakota also does not mandate a grace period. There is no state law requiring any specific number of days before a late fee can be charged. If your lease says rent is due on the first and a late fee applies on the second, that's enforceable. However, most South Dakota landlords include a grace period of 3 to 5 days as standard practice. The key legal principle is reasonableness under South Dakota contract law. A late fee is essentially a liquidated damages provision, and South Dakota courts will enforce it if the fee represents a reasonable pre-estimate of the landlord's anticipated damages from the late payment. If the fee is grossly disproportionate to the landlord's actual costs, administrative time, follow-up communication, bank fees, the time value of money, a court can refuse to enforce it as an unenforceable penalty. What's reasonable in South Dakota? The state has one of the more affordable rental markets in the country, and the fee should reflect the local rent level. A flat fee of $25 to $50 or a percentage-based fee of 5 to 10% of the monthly rent is generally defensible. Given South Dakota's typical rents, many units in Sioux Falls rent for $800 to $1,300, and rents in smaller communities are lower. The dollar amounts are modest. A $50 late fee on a $900 rent is about 5.5%, well within the reasonable range. A $200 fee on the same rent would likely face challenge. The lease must clearly state the late fee terms. The lease should specify the rent due date, any grace period, the exact fee amount or formula when the fee triggers, and whether additional charges apply for continued non-payment. South Dakota courts are unlikely to enforce a late fee that isn't clearly documented in the lease. Oral agreements about late fees invite disputes and are difficult to enforce. Compounding late fees in South Dakota are governed by the lease terms and the reasonableness standard. A single one-time fee after the grace period is straightforward and easily defensible. A daily or weekly compounding structure must still produce a total that's reasonable. A compounding structure that could generate fees exceeding 15 or 20% of the monthly rent within a few weeks would likely be challenged. The interaction between late fees and the eviction process in South Dakota is fast. South Dakota allows just 3 days' notice for non-payment of rent before the landlord can begin eviction proceedings. This is one of the shortest notice periods in the country. The fast timeline means that late fee disputes and eviction proceedings can overlap almost immediately. Whether unpaid late fees can be included in the 3-day notice depends on how the lease defines them. If late fees are defined as additional rent, they can be included in the total amount demanded. If the lease treats them as a separate charge, the landlord may need to pursue the fees independently. Best practice: define late fees as additional rent in your lease to simplify the process. South Dakota has specific provisions regarding the security deposit that interact with late fees. Under South Dakota Codified Laws Section 4332.6.1, the deposit is limited to 1 month's rent unless the landlord can demonstrate special conditions, justifying a larger amount. The deposit must be returned within 2 weeks if no deductions are claimed, or within 45 days if deductions apply. Unpaid late fees can be deducted from the deposit if the lease authorizes the deduction and the fees are reasonable. For tenants receiving Housing Choice Voucher assistance, South Dakota landlords should not charge late fees when the housing authority's portion is delayed due to processing. The tenant cannot control the housing authority's payment timeline. Focus late fee enforcement on the tenant's portion. If the tenant pays their share on time, the fee should not apply simply because the authority's payment arrived late. South Dakota's military population is centered around Ellsworth Air Force Base near Rapid City. Military pay is predictable, and most military tenants pay reliably. When late payments occur from Ellsworth personnel, they're typically related to PCS transitions that resolve quickly. The standard 3 to 5 day grace period accommodates most of these short delays. The Bakken Oil region in western South Dakota, near the North Dakota border, has experienced boom and bust rental dynamics. During active drilling periods, energy workers flood in and demand is strong. During downturns, workers leave and the market softens. Late payment patterns in oil-influenced communities can correlate with energy market cycles. When the market is strong, workers are employed and pay reliably. When activity slows, workers may lose hours or jobs, and late payments increase. Landlords in these areas should calibrate their late fee expectations to economic conditions. From a practical standpoint, South Dakota's rental market is small and concentrated. Sioux Falls is the state's largest and most active rental market. The economy is driven by healthcare, Sanford Health and Avra Health, financial services, agribusiness, and manufacturing. When Sioux Falls tenants pay late, it's typically a short delay rather than chronic non-payment. Most Sioux Falls landlords charge flat fees in the range of $35 to $75 with a 5-day grace period. Rapid City, the state's second-largest city, has a market influenced by tourism, healthcare, and Ellsworth AFB. Military late payments from Ellsworth are uncommon and typically resolve quickly. Tourism sector workers may have seasonal income fluctuations that affect payment timing. Brookings, home to South Dakota State University, and Vermilion, home to the University of South Dakota, have student-driven markets. Student late payments typically correlate with the financial aid disbursement cycle. Some landlords near these universities anticipate semester start delays and build a slightly longer grace period into their leases for student tenants. Aberdeen, Watertown, Mitchell, Pierre, and Huron have smaller markets with more limited tenant pools. Rents are affordable, and late fee amounts should reflect the lower rent levels. A late fee that represents a reasonable percentage of a $500 rent produces a very modest dollar amount, which is appropriate for these markets. One best practice for South Dakota landlords: because the state has essentially no statutory framework for late fees, your lease is your primary document. Include a detailed provision that covers every contingency: due date, grace period, fee amount, trigger date, whether compounding applies, any cap on total fees, and whether the fee is defined as additional rent. In a state where the statute provides no guidance, the lease fills every gap. Another best practice: set your fee at a level that's meaningful enough to incentivize on-time payment, but reasonable enough to survive challenge. In Sioux Falls, a fee of 5 to 8% of the monthly rent hits this balance. In smaller markets with lower rents, a flat fee of $25 to $40 is typically appropriate. A third best practice: apply your late fee policy consistently across all tenants and document every instance. South Dakota's limited regulatory framework means disputes are resolved based on the lease terms and the evidence. Your records of consistent enforcement, dates, amounts, communications, are your best protection in any dispute. Selective enforcement creates fair housing risk, regardless of how minimal the state's regulatory framework is. For the complete guide to South Dakota late fee laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our late fee law series.